Our next speaker is Professor Vivian LOFTNESS, who's the Paul Mellon Chair and University Professor at Carnegie Mellon University, speaking about the critical role of the built environment for a carbon neutral future. Thank you so much, Professor LOFTNESS, for joining us, and feel free to share your screen.
Okay, thank you so much for including me in this really dynamic group of people. I wish I were a social scientist. Let's see, has that not gone full screen? There we go. Because ultimately the question that I have two questions, and I'm hoping that this group of experts will give me some insights in which one I should be focusing on during my time here. So let me start by saying I'm a building scientist, an architect, and urbanist focused on the future of the built environment relative to a carbon neutral future. I began to do work with the National Academy of Science in the United States. We actually produced two reports, one in 2021 and one in 2024, that was looking at defining what federal actions were needed over the next 10 years to actually get us to a fair and equitable path to net zero by 2050. And you can see in the list that the experts came from transportation, from carbon, from energy, from industry. And I was the only buildings person in the first report and one of two for the second report. And it posed a really interesting challenge. So you can see here the roster of incredibly smart people from around the United States and multiple disciplines who actually do not fundamentally believe that buildings is a critical factor in carbon neutrality. We did produce a common set of goals to electrify all transportation, buildings, and industry, to improve the efficiency and productivity of the actual subsectors, to produce carbon-free electricity, to promote innovation, and to make sure that the infrastructure was in place for this carbon neutral future. We also collectively agreed on what the benefits were in terms of strengthening economy, supporting communities, businesses, and workers, promoting equity, and maximizing cost effectiveness. What we did not agree on was where the action should occur. And so this pie chart, in which you see the building sector is about 13, this is just the US greenhouse gas production, is about 13% of the problem. And transportation is 28, and industry is 23, and agriculture is 9, and electric power is 27%. So ultimately, this is the diagram that is influencing all the rest of the committee. And I spent a whole chunk of time trying to convince them that electric power is not an end-use sector, that it actually gets distributed into industry, transportation, and residential and commercial buildings. So you can see residential commercial looks almost like it's non-existent. So why bother? It's a complicated field, too many players. Even Project Drawdown, which is Paul Hawkins' goals for how we achieve carbon neutrality, you can see buildings are like 6% of the solution, but electricity is 25%. So somehow the electric sector has become an end-use sector rather than a supply. This would be laughable if it wasn't so pervasive. IPCC, the Eurostat, the World Economic Forum, the World in Data, buildings are somewhere between 6%, 7%, 5.6%. Eurostat actually puts it up at 13%. I have to research why that is. But electricity is this big chunk. Even the IEA, the other IEA, begins to look at buildings as sort of 9%, a little teeny bubble. Why bother? It's just not, but electricity and steam is 40% of the greenhouse gas. The reason this has occurred is because somewhere back, the scientific community decided to break everything up into scope 1, 2, and 3, things that were directly combusted at the site. So when you drive a car with gasoline, you combust and create greenhouse gases directly. When you do a hot water heater or a heating system that uses gas or oil, you're combusting directly. That's the only thing that shows up in the end-use sector. All of the electricity production that goes into those end-use sectors is now assigned to the electricity sector. So that means that all the dark gray bars do not show up in the actual end use sectors. They show up in their own bar. It's killing me. It's killing the profession and the investment and the commitment to better buildings. The Energy Information Agency in the United States has realized that the electricity is not quite an end-use sector, so they pulled it out of the end-use sector lineup and created their own little sector. But 70% of that gray box is in this residential and commercial. So instead of it being a small piece of the answer, it's actually it is the largest piece of the answer. So this one popped up in the New York Times in November a year ago. It just shocked me to see diagrams like this, where look how effective we can get at improving the built environment for reducing carbon. I mean, it's like a laughable improvement. Whereas if we can get better electric production, we can do dramatic reductions. And so, of course, all the energy and public policy is focused on the power and to some extent transportation, and much more modestly in industry. So I am trying to find a way to communicate to the decision makers, the misinformation crowd, who are in many cases nonprofits and journalists and public policy makers, that electric power should never be in these pie charts because it's not an end-use sector, that it should be redistributed immediately into the end-use sectors, which would all of a sudden put buildings as a big chunk of the answer. And even the industrial and the sector, a big chunk of the industrial carbon is in the built environment. And this is what's known as embodied carbon. And that would increase it even more. And truthfully, even transportation, because of land use policies and the inability to invest in shared transit systems, has an impact on our carbon footprint, which could be considered part of the built environment. So here's my challenge. The other half of my challenge is to have the answer set. And one of the questions I want to ask this group is whether I should focus on the problem of perception or I should focus on the answer set. I'll come back to that. The answer set is, to me, pretty clear. Buildings are the sloppiest use of fossil fuel and electricity. This is a Michael Bloomberg report out when Bloomberg mandated that all buildings, both public and private, bigger than 1,000 square meters, had to actually publicly share their energy data, something you see quite pervasively in Europe, but you do not see in the United States. It became evident that, the hotels, the best and the worst hotels would consume, 320%, the worst ones as compared to their peers. Or office buildings, 450% more energy used than the best. Or retail, 800% more energy used than the best. So all of a sudden it became evident that we're very sloppy, that we have a lot of opportunity to save. And actually the architectural community, all 95,000 in the United States, have actually signed what's called the 2030 Challenge to benchmark every building they design, both major retrofits and new construction, and are driving towards carbon neutrality by 2030. With a target of 70% reduction, with the last 30% met with renewables. And they're getting there. They're making huge progress. I mean, the design and engineering community can do this, but there has to be a pull. It's not happening by the goodness of the profession. Policy matters terribly. So you can see here the green states are absolutely the best at reducing carbon per capita, and they have policies for the built environment and stringent policies. Obviously, New York State and California, and they're in the case of California, you can see that while they held greenhouse gas emissions flat, the population grew and the gross domestic product grew over a period of 15 or 25 years. And in many cases, the GDP per the greenhouse gas per GDP was substantially reduced. So actions that we can take, the ACEEE, the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, has been tracking what actions. They have basically said, if we're going to get to carbon neutrality through all of our sectors, the true end-use sectors, we have to achieve about a 50 quad drop by 2050 in the US. Appliance and equipment efficiency can give us 5.6 quads. So that's over 10% of that goal can be achieved just by standards, which, by the way, the present administration has just dumped But ultimately, the Energy Star product standards have been incredibly influential. Refrigerators were just wildly out of scale in terms of how much energy they used per unit of activity, and standards have pushed them back down to levels that you didn't see since the 1950s, with much bigger refrigerators, more functionality, and much less energy than where we were back in the 70s. So these standards are incredibly impactful and very important to the answer. Zero energy goals for new homes and commercial buildings. And this is where the states of New York and Massachusetts and California and Minnesota have done major strides to say, we must reduce demand and you are going to produce carbon neutral buildings. About 5.7 quads of the 50 quads, another 10% can be achieved just by writing the right standards. Combined heat, cooling, and power, something we don't do much in the US. This is Stockholm, Sweden, relatively new development in a brownfield right across the water from Stockholm itself, completely heated from waste heat off of the power plant. 70% of the energy in a power plant goes up into the clouds as steam. And what they do is they trap it and turn it into a hot water loop that's feeding all of these houses heat. So it becomes a far more efficient system. But you have to get the built environment as an integral part of the utility. Retrofits have a significant benefit, and this is where passive house standards that you see much more pervasively in Europe than you do in the US have been very influential. I personally have an agenda about what I call environmental surfing, which is the need to design buildings to use nature as the dominant conditioning system. So use nature for daylight, no electric lights on during the day. Use nature for passive solar-free heat, natural ventilation for breathing, natural ventilation for cooling, night ventilation for cooling, thermal mass for free cooling, and actually making laws that forbid obese buildings where people are either in basements or deep into the heart of the building. Again, something you do not see in Europe, but you do see pervasively in the US because there are no laws to stop us from building oversized buildings. Technology helps. It is not the answer, although advanced equipment would certainly be a key part of the answer, but it does give us the potential to control things in a far more efficient way, and about 3.2 quads of our 50 quads can be achieved through smart homes and commercial buildings. Electrification will help, but not as much as we think. It only will reduce about 0.9 quads unless we get all renewables. Of course, the key there is to get all renewables before we start to electrify, because otherwise we're just going to be using inefficient electric sources from the fossil fuels. And that leads me to the point that buildings are not just about the demand side, they're actually also about the supply side. They have a critical role in electricity generation, in peak load management, and in energy storage. Every building needs to start to generate its own, and it needs to actually manage the peaks, and it needs to store the renewables so that you essentially, the utility doesn't see those peaks. The New Buildings Institute is one, and the Rocky Mountain Institute both have argued that if we look at their present load profiles, we see a real demand on the utility grid by midday or late afternoon. If we do efficiency, we just lower the curve, but we don't solve the curve. If we put on-site PV, we create what they call the duck curve, which is considered to be a real insult to the utility because it means there's no demand in the middle of the day. But if you actually design buildings as part of the grid with efficiency and distributed solar and load flexibility through storage, you can actually flatten the load. So all of a sudden, the utilities don't have to be expanded for electrification. They can be maxed out for the economy. And then they came up with 5 foundations. I think it's important to realize that the embodied carbon piece that everyone in the architectural world is focused on now is really the last line of attack. It's not the biggest thing. It's what's embodied in the materials we choose, but we have so much sloppiness in consumption. We have such a paucity of renewable. We've not figured out how to integrate with the grid and store it. And obviously we're not yet at a point where we're electrifying. And again, all of this is going to be flatlined for this administration. So I don't know if I'm speaking to the next administration or whom. If I get to embodied carbon, the big issues are use of concrete, steel, aluminum, insulation, and plastics. This is a pretty small piece of the bigger sloppy energy demand side, but an important piece for all the super efficient design community. And we are definitely switching to carbon sequestering materials. You can see people moving away from XPS foam or spray foam or even mineral wool and fiberglass, which are benign, into wood fiber because it actually sequesters. The same is true with concrete and shifting from concrete and steel to wood construction. Here's what a zero carbon building looks like. It generates its own electricity. It's using wood. It obviously tries to get all the embodied down to a minimum, and then it meets the load on site with storage. And these are beautiful buildings. This is a Georgia Tech academic building that has a very, very low load and is meeting its load on site. The transportation piece of this, I don't know how deeply I can get into it, but most buildings are not tagged for transportation. Even though every time we build a new shopping mall that has to be only accessed by a car, or a new office park, or in the case of EDF, the creation of the campus in Saclay, and what it does to the transportation costs of every person who goes to work there is an important question for the design community. There's a wonderful article by Jones, Wheeler, and Kamen at Berkeley that looks at 700 California communities and rethinks the transportation component to do transit-oriented development, where everybody is in walking communities. And it's just hugely impactful. Of course, so is diet, hugely impactful. Energy efficiency in the building is hugely impactful. And the goods that we buy can be hugely impactful. So a wonderful study that talks about the importance of transit-oriented development. All of this is good for jobs. It's good for health. I mean, the message is there. The question for me is what message I should focus on for this month while I'm here. McKinsey basically shows that the carbon cost per unit of greenhouse gas reduction, everything that is easy to pay for is building sector related. Everything that is extremely expensive is where actually people are investing. Carbon capture and storage is hugely interesting to big industry, as well as the future incubator industries. And federal funding, not just in the US, but around the world, is figuring out ways that we can bury our carbon in the oceans, in the earth. And all of this is just being ignored because buildings don't matter, 6-7% of the problem. The reports are available for anyone who's really interested. My questions to you are, should I focus on why do policymakers ignore the role of the built environment as a linchpin for mitigation and adaptation to climate change? And I've got some ideas, which I won't talk about now. Or what are the priority investments in the built environment for greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation to climate change? Should I focus on the answers or the problem? Do I have to convince all of the leaders who are still putting out those pie charts, including the New York Times? And unfortunately, I'm not a social scientist or a journalist, so I can use a lot of help on this. Anyway, with that, I'm going to close and maybe hit escape so I can get feedback from people in the audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Any questions? Yes, Adi first and then Pavel.
Well, thank you, Vivian, for a very dense and rich presentation. And I think we should give you much more time for this. So what's amazing here is that obviously we have a lot of answers, but we don't know how to put them through, right? If that's my understanding. And so maybe because maybe because we're trying to get solutions for everything. So obviously there's regulation that is necessary, but as we all know, we have a lot of resistance, lobbies, etc., and it's very slow and difficult. And perhaps the first thing of your two questions, I'm afraid you will have to address the two, but the first one first, because that explains what's the problem. So understanding the the chain of decisions and who are the stakeholders and why it blocks is perhaps a way forward, because these are different strategies and these are different problems. As you noted, I mean, commercial buildings are very different from residential, because it's different type of action, different types of ownerships, right? And you do not have the same power of negotiation with I mean, if you want to have to address, as you know, I've worked for 15 years at an energy provider, so I'm sensitive to the questions of load issues, but this is not something one individual household will do. It has to be at a higher level. So my guess is that there's probably a series of different targets for which you have to demonstrate, because people know things, but if they don't see them, they don't believe them. And so providing them some types of solution and examples of people having done the right thing for similar cases. This is why I have one question. You had created this wonderful tool that was the building investment decision system, that a huge database on hundreds of actual constructions or retrofit, and showing the impact of economic impact and all that on churn, on energy efficiency. Does this thing still exist? This is the kind of tools that people could know, just like, I'm an individual household. What can I do for what have they done for a similar house? What did they gain? What did they lose? But maybe it's a huge problem. Why not attacking it piecemeal, right?
Yeah. Okay. So you're suggesting that I need to do both sides of this, the challenge, both the sort of to correct the understanding of how serious the built environment is, or how important it is to.
No, but what I suggest is start by the first, because that will enable decision makers to see that there are a specific piece of the problem and that there are specific solutions for them and what they should look for. Maybe they're not there yet, but that each one should look at their own problem locally and look for the solutions in the right places.
Yeah, and the answer to the second part, Sadi, yes, the BIDS database is still live and active, and I have graduate students every year introducing new findings. We are trying to build a database for those on the call that takes buildings system by system and shows the environmental and social benefits of investing in better buildings. So looking at health and productivity, and economic return, all the reasons why you would want to invest in a better lighting system, or a better, or access to daylight, and understanding that there's actual real long-term benefits. So yes, that database still exists, and I could use that if that is the way to convince decision makers to invest in the built environment. That would, I mean, there's no question that I could use that relative to many of those solution sets that I tried to outline in that talk.
Thanks.
Great. And Pavo next.
Cool. Hey, everyone. Thanks, Vivian, for this presentation. Super interesting. The prior one, Michelle, also was fantastic. I think you have such a great opportunity with the first question you posed to us, that would be much more interesting for me. I mean, I think the planning and architecture and design world have a lot of solutions, and I see so many times like solutions, proposing solutions, but you have like this really great identified incongruity or problem in the way people think about a problem, and you know how to correct it. And I think having the opportunity to reframe this understanding of energy or electricity production as the problem, it would be fantastic. So I think, you know, like with for example, in the mobility world, eventually the activists got journalists to stop saying car accidents, and now we say car crashes. And I think that's the kind of thing that really changes the way people think about it. So I would be curious to know kind of what you see as the blocks in getting those charts to break down electrical production into, you know, at least maybe it's too, you know, there's too many different end uses of electricity. So proposing, like having a proposed set of end uses that would be a more disaggregated and accurate way to think about it. I don't know. I mean, I think, so I'd be curious to hear what, you know, what you've heard in terms of pushback on that, And then, I mean, I think that you do a survey of people that are pushing back and why, and you kind of dig into that, I think would be super interesting and impactful.
Thank you, Pavel. That's actually very helpful. There are two questions I want to come back with. One is, what's the published vehicle that I should pursue? I mean, do I write an open access journal article, or do I write to the New York Times? And specifically call out those international agencies for putting up again and again and again pie charts that are erroneous. I mean, and I'm trying to figure out a little bit about the audience. I think the second issue for me that's raised here is trying to very specifically, when you said figure out exactly what end uses you want to assign things to, I had trouble with the National Academy Committee. And these are the smartest people in the country. I mean, these are really smart data people. And I kept saying, you guys, we cannot do business as usual. We cannot continue to build buildings and stuff them full of hardware and locate them in places that require transportation energy and think that we can solve all of that just by getting more and more renewables. And they said, oh, no, of course we can't. We're going to have to do carbon capture and storage. So they've already leapfrogged the middle of the thing to how we're going to bury our trash, our carbon dioxide trash, or other greenhouse gases, right? Rather than saying, wait a minute, all we have to do is to focus on the middle, and our renewables would meet the load. It was amazing to me that I couldn't convince them of that, even though we were together, online and in person for almost 4 years. So I'm really, it is interesting to me. If I can get the language to change and certainly those diagrams to change, that would be really fantastic.
Just quickly, I think op-ed is important. And I think even in the act of doing a project where you want to interview all the people whose minds you need to change, and I think that interview process could actually produce the change itself. And then, tell them, I'm going to be publishing a study based on my interviews with you, why you won't accept this better way to frame the problem. And then having them have to justify it to you might actually produce the change.
I might need more social science training before I do this, but okay.
You're convincing. Yeah.
Great. There was one in the chat. Would maybe Ming Chan would like to say the question, or should I read it?
Sure. Sorry. I'm partly in transit in Canada. So anyways, some of your dilemma makes me think of Adam Kahane's book, Collaborating with the Enemy. He is part of this Paris Idea program, although right now I know he's physically in Canada because he's here in Winnipeg today. So anyways, just something to think about in terms of strategy. I think part of the issue is that the National Academy is still very siloed, right? There are many people, many voices, and probably no social scientists or not enough social scientists. That's part of the dilemma. Although I really appreciate the previous comment about actually interviewing or understanding your resistors in terms of the change, right? When we think about leading change, I think is very compelling. The other piece that I put in the chat is, I think we don't use stories. So the most compelling parts of your presentation to me were actually some of the examples of the building itself, which I think Sadi put in the chat as well. And that the diagram in terms of the household and, all of our personal and corporate, in terms of the carbon footprint, I think that was also interesting. So just thinking about the use of stories, individual stories in the telling. And then the last piece is you asked whether you should publish a paper. I think you should write an op-ed. I don't know if that's New York Times, but in Canada, the op-eds are the governments do pay attention to op-eds. And then there are specific companies that help support the writing of those for a fee. So that's all I'll share. Thanks.
I'd be curious to know those companies, just out of curiosity, who's.
Sure. Let me try and find the one that I have made contact with. It might take me a bit of time, but probably before the session ends. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
All right. We have a few more minutes if anyone has. Yes, that way.
Well, if I can comment with one anecdote to illustrate the power of using the buildings themselves as demonstration. I mean, people know things, but they start believing them when they actually experience. So showing a good solution to a problem that is yours is very convincing. Actually, Professor LOFTNESS and Professor Houtkopf worked with us when I was at EDF, and when the first time Volker Houtkopf presented the kind of things that Vivian just showed us to the board of the R&D at the time, that was 1999 or something. R&D, like €500 million turnover, big things, etc. They almost fired me for bringing him in, right? Now, 7 years later, after seeing what they have done, and after visiting some of the buildings they have built, they actually asked them to organize the architecture contest for their new R&D, flagship center, right? And that was EDF. That was the nuclear major actor and all the rest of it. So industry can change. Industry is not evil, and people are not bad per se. They just want to be shown an easy solution that addresses their problems. And in my experience, I've hardly ever been able to sell very innovative projects on paper. I always had to show a proof of concept. And the impact of these things is unbelievable. I mean, compared to the best project or whatever, it just doesn't cut compared to just showing that the thing works. And so perhaps just documenting these stories, just as Minka just said, is perhaps the good thing. It might be quite interesting for consultants or the advisors to know the answers from your first questions of who are the stakeholders and why and the problems, etc. But if you want to convince the decision makers, it's basically by showing them that this stuff actually works. Usually they say, oh, it's too difficult, it's impossible, we can't do it. And they say, well, sorry, we've done it, it's right there. And then this changes.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. We have 2 minutes if someone has anything else. So if not, thank you so much, Professor LOFTNESS, for your presentation and the question.